In the United States, we celebrate a day of Thanksgiving, the fourth Thursday of November each year. For a couple of years now, I've wanted to make some kind of wall decoration to have up during the Thanksgiving holiday season. I went to a Joann fabric store a couple of weeks ago to pick out fabric for this project. They had moved everything around in the store and changed the system at their cutting table. Instead of the take a number system, they now have a kiosk that you sign in at. Jenny Doan did a video showing how to make a Thanksgiving wall hanging, offering a free printable pattern for the components that she used in her wall hanging. I'll leave the link to her video in the description box. For the feathers, I'm using an assortment of fabrics and scraps that I already have. I purchased this turkey and pumpkin fabric for the backing at Joann's, and this tannish fabric I'm going to use as the background fabric, and I believe I got that at Hobby Lobby. I printed out the pattern from the link that Jenny Doan left on her video. It has a pattern for two different sizes of turkeys, the thankful writing, a moon, some clouds, some pumpkins and stems, turkey legs, and a beak. I'm using a product called Wonder Under Fusible Web. I'll trace the pattern onto the fusible web, then iron it onto the fabric that I want to use. Then I will cut out the patterns, peel off the paper backing, and then iron it onto the background fabric that I have. It comes on a bolt-like fabric. The pattern pieces are very bold and easy to trace, so I just put them under the fusible web and trace out the pieces that I want to use. I'm not using all of the pattern pieces for the project that I'm making because I'm kind of doing my own thing. But I traced the turkey head, the body, 5 pumpkins and stems, the feet and beak, and the thankful writing. I cut out the tracings with paper scissors. With the wrong side of the fabric facing up, I iron the fabric to prepare it and then lay the tracing down with the bumpy side down and the paper side up. The iron is on the hottest setting with no steam, and I keep it on the tracing for 10 seconds so that it will adhere to the fabric. On a project I was doing before, I had the fusible web that I was ironing onto the fabric, and I had one of the pieces upside down. And luckily, I caught it before I placed the iron on top of it. So be careful, you'll have a horrible mess on your iron if you do that. Also, you'll notice that I'm careful not to iron the overhanging pieces of Wonder Under onto the ironing board. I went ahead and cut out all of the pieces with fabric scissors. When I first saw the video that Jenny Doan did of the turkey wall hanging, I was excited because I had a Dresden template But after some trial and error, I realized that mine was not the same dimensions as hers was. This was the first set of turkey feathers that I did, and I wasn't happy with it. If you have that same Dresden ruler that Jenny Doan showed in the video, go ahead and use that. But if you don't, I'm going to show you how you can do it without a Dresden ruler. The tail feathers piece is basically 2/3 of a Dresden plate pattern. So I gathered together the pieces that I wanted to use for the tail feathers. I'm cutting a piece of fabric 5.5 inches and a little bit bigger than 2.5 inches. You can probably get by with being less wasteful than I was. With a pen, I marked 2.5 inches at the top. I then found the middle of 2.5 inches and drew a line from the top to the bottom directly in the middle. Then at the bottom of that line, I measured 1 inch, but put the middle of the 1 inch on the line that I had drawn. Then I positioned my straight edge from the bottom line to the top line and made a cut, and then did the same on the other side. Now I have my pattern piece measuring in length 5.5 inches. It measures 2.5 inches at the top and 1 inch at the bottom. This gave me my pattern that I used to cut out the rest of my pieces. You could make a pattern out of cardstock or cardboard if you wanted to. I just used one of the pieces that I had cut out, and I used that to cut out the rest of the pieces. And it worked out fine, using the ruler as the straight edge. I put a new blade in my rotary cutter so I could do 4 pieces of fabric at a time. You may want to make your feather pieces a different dimension, but I wouldn't go larger than 1 inch on the bottom, as I just barely had enough room to put the round piece of the turkey body on it. Jenny Doan used 14 feather pieces. I ended up using 17. With the feather pieces cut out, I'm ready to do some sewing. So I fold the feather piece in half vertically and then make a 1/4 inch seam just on the top folded part. I went ahead and chain pieced all of these at once. I did tack it down at the beginning of the seam, not always at the end, but I found that when I didn't tack it down and then I pulled it right side out, that it had a tendency to pull apart real easy. I pulled them right side out and then gave them a good press so that they would sew up easier. Then back to the sewing machine to sew the tail feathers together. I press them down flat And this is before I have finished with the tail feathers. I added a few more to this. I felt like the fabric that I cut out for the circle part of the turkey didn't contrast enough with the fabric that I used for the head. So I'm deciding here to cut out a different piece out of this fabric. The finished wall hanging measures 26 by 26. I did cut the background fabric a little bit larger than that. To begin with, it was 28 by 28. Here I am laying everything out onto the ironing board, getting ready to pull off the paper backing and iron on our pattern pieces and get the turkey centered, or the tail feathers centered. I folded over the fabric 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch on the end feather pieces of the turkey feathers so that that raw edge would not be showing. I like the way the writing and the letters turned out on this. It's such a great way to add words to a wall hanging. I'm pinning the tail feathers on and making sure everything's secure, and then centering the circle part of the body around the tail feathers, or on top of the tail feathers. Then the turkey's head goes on top of that, and his legs go underneath the body, the circle part, and the head and the body. And then I also added the beak and then ironed everything on. I'm just arranging the pumpkins on either side of the turkey. I have 5 pumpkins total, and I put the stems on. Some of them are upside down, but nobody will know unless I tell them. I laid the backing on my table wrong side up and cut it at 28 inches square. And then I laid a layer of batting on top of that and cut that 28 inches square. I smoothed it out really well before I put the top piece on top. Once I had the top piece on top, I smoothed it out really well and then pinned everything together with quilting safety pins. Quilter safety pins are bent so that you can put them on and take them off more easily. You could also baste it with thread if you didn't have that many safety pins, or use a spray adhesive baste. The first time I sewed this, I went from the wide part to the skinny part closest to the circle, and that made the circle part pucker. I hadn't done all of the tail feathers, so I picked out what I had done, and I would suggest, and here I am now, sewing from the skinny part of the tail feather to the wide part. And that worked out much better. I don't know why I forgot to put my walking foot on to do this project, but I didn't remember until I was almost done. So that would help also with keeping the fabric from shifting and moving and puckering. You can outline the tail feathers by using a blanket stitch or any kind of embroidery stitch and doing it by hand with embroidery floss, but I wanted to try doing it by machine. And since I haven't done very much of the decorative stitches on my sewing machine, I did a little practice. I did a couple of practice runs, and I wanted to see what size I would prefer for this. This one that I just did was the larger of the two, and I just felt like it left bigger holes. It would have looked nice, but I went ahead and I practiced doing the smaller stitch, and that's the one that I eventually went with. I used some of the tail feathers that I had made that were a different size to practice with on just a scrap piece of fabric, and I felt like it was good to do that before doing the whole outline of the tail feathers. I also outlined the circle of the turkey's body, the turkey head, his legs, and the pumpkins. This is the bigger blanket stitch here. So now I'm just going to outline the pieces that I have appliqued on this background fabric. If you didn't want to do a decorative stitch on this, you could just use a straight stitch to tack down or keep the tail feathers in place. And as for the rest of it, the pumpkins and the feet, you wouldn't need to do a decorative stitch around those if you didn't want to. You could just leave those plain, and it would be fine if that's what you wanted to do. My stitching around curvy designs is not always the best, but I'm going to just go with it anyway. You'll do better on the turkey head and pumpkins than I did. Now, onto the quilting portion of the show. I just drew some lines shadowing the tail feathers, and I also shadowed the pumpkins, the feet, and the writing. And so I really didn't do a whole lot of quilting on this. You can quilt this like you would a quilt. You could take this project to someone who has a long armor or who has a quilting machine. If you had a free motion foot for your sewing machine, you could meander or quilt it using that. So you can be as fancy or as simple as you want to be. It's all up to you. Now I'm just trimming up the sides and the top and the bottom, and it ended up, the final measurements ended up being 26 inches square. I'm sewing the binding on this, and I had planned on sewing after I flipped it over to the back. I planned on doing the final stitching by machine, but I ended up doing the last part by hand. I have a playlist with some videos on it that explain binding in more detail if you're interested in that. And voila, here you have my version of the thankful wall hanging. Happy Thanksgiving a couple of months early. If you have really eagle eyesight, you may notice that some of the friction pen is still, the markings are still on it, just very faintly, but those will dissipate in a couple more days. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.